All right, welcome to Crude Talk, where we talk everything oil and gas in upstream. I'm your host, Justin Vandenbrink, and today we're talking NMR, also known as nuclear magnetic resonance, and basically how it applies to rock analysis. So we have two people as our guests today, and I'm very happy to have with us Matt Boyce from EPOCH Consulting, and as well Elizabeth Krukowski with Premier Oilfield Group. So why don't we just start out right away with introducing each of you, quick bio on where you come from, and maybe start with you, Matt.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm a geologist and petrophysicist by training. I got my degrees from University of Arkansas and West Virginia University. And I started industry working at CECO in the early 2000s with the help and just watching them discover the Fayetteville. And I later went to Exxon and was part of their core group for petrophysical analysis and or formation evaluation. And then after that, went to Southwestern Energy. And, while I was at Southwestern and while I was at Exxon, I developed a pretty good appreciation for core analysis. And specifically, when I went to Southwestern, I got really into NMR, which is what we're talking about today. And to the point, we worked on buying a machine at Southwestern, and I helped I was the main person who helped with building the lab. So a core NMR machine, so I'm very knowledgeable with that background and a practical perspective, and then how to incorporate it, and subsequently published a paper. And in 2018, started my own consulting group, which has primarily focused on petrophysics and geology and incorporating them, specifically with core analysis related to NMR, and then how that affects people's.
Oh, that's awesome, and that's you're the right guy at the right time for us to do this. We're really excited to learn more about NMR. So thank you for being here. Now, Elizabeth, yourself.
I'm originally from ConocoPhillips, so back when they had their subsurface labs in existence, I started out my career in their subsurface labs. I actually have more of a geology and spectroscopy background, so it was mainly actually Raman spectroscopy. So most of my NMR knowledge has been gained through the lab and through the subsurface lab, doing work with ConocoPhillips, specifically when they were doing their unconventional research to see how they could best get the permeability, porosity, all the typical parameters you want from a rock, but within these unconventional reservoirs.
Okay. And if I'm not mistaken, both of you got educated in West Virginia?
No. Virginia Tech is it's not West yet.
You're Virginia
Yeah.
and you're West Virginia, right, Matt?
That's right. I'm West Virginia University.
So we have competing states here. That's interesting. But that whole area, being up there myself, the whole East Coast, just real quality geologists, really appreciate all the geologists up there and what they're doing for our industry. So I guess really the first question is, for some of those that are watching and listening, NMR, they don't know. They've probably heard of NMR for the first time 3 minutes ago. Myself, I'm not very educated on that. And that's really why we want to do this podcast, was to kind of give people more background on what NMR really is and how it actually applies to like the industry itself. So maybe could you start us off, Matt?
As I can. So any of you guys who are listening and familiar, sorry for not going into more detail. But NMR, if a lot of you are familiar, if you've ever gone to the hospital or had some sort of injury, it's basically an MRI. So you get a concussion, you get an MRI. That is NMR. And what you're doing is you're essentially polarizing certain molecules that we're looking at. And in the hospital, you're looking at one thing, so you can image your brain, or you can image whatever you're looking at. For what we do, what we're doing is we're using those magnets to polarize and specifically hydrogen. And we've chosen, of course, hydrogen in the oil industry just because hydrogen is in water, it's in oil, it's in gas. I mean, it's one of the main constituents we're looking for. And so what we do is it's an electromagnet. And we, for the sake of kind of breaking this down easy, you put a piece of rock into a machine that has its own magnetic field that it's generating. And it's going to change the spin of that molecule, in this case, the hydrogen, to go to the direction of that machine. Now, the time it takes for us to change that spin, that's our first measurement. That's called T1. Now, what we do after that is then we say, okay, we're going to turn that field over. We're basically going to flip it. And then we're going to rotate it. and then we're going to take away that field in the machine, and it's going to go back to the way it was normally spinning. Now, the time it takes to go back to being normal is going to be T2. So we're measuring two things. The time it takes to polarize at T1, the time it takes to relax, which is the T2, and everything that we see in the industry or that's in the rock, specifically water, oil, gas, polarizes and relaxes at a very specific rate. So the reason that's so important is that we have a passive way that's non-destructive to measure every single component of porosity. Movable water, movable oil, movable gas. These are things that when you get to standard core analysis can sometimes be difficult to quantify. And with NMR, it becomes incredibly precise. And that's kind of the overview of what we're measuring and why it's so influential on the rock.
So again, you are, as an operator, wanting to know what of the three components are in your reservoir: the oil, the water, and the gas, correct? And obviously you're looking, and the NMR, before NMR, what would they have done to do the exact same sort of analysis? Or was there anything to do?
There was other things that are attempted. There always are. And I'm sure Elizabeth can talk about that in detail. You've got the routine core analysis that we did for conventional reservoirs. You've also got the crushed rock or GRI or any of those types of methods. Now, I should mention that routine, the conventional way, it requires to have essentially really good permeability. The whole reason we started crushing rocks for something like GRI was because we didn't have very good permeability. So we had to access the rock differently in order to measure those.
Right.
The reason NMR becomes so important in that unconventional world is that we don't have to destroy it, and it doesn't take as long.
Ah, okay. So time as well is you are saving time with NMR versus the routine core analysis.
That's right. It can save some time on that as well.
So, Elizabeth, what are some of the challenges? We saw some of the values for NMR. Mm-hmm. You work at the Premier Labs here, and you're dealing with this on a daily basis, much similar to Matt. Mm-hmm. What do you find are some of the challenges? I mean, it's not just all perfect, right? There are some challenges. Maybe you could speak to those.
So specifically when we go through our unconventional workflow, I mean, a huge thing is making sure we even have enough fluid in the sample just to start. So we always do an as received measurement, and our instruments are rated. We have it about a milliliter of fluid. So we're measuring literally milliliters of fluid in these core plugs. And so if it's under a milliliter, we try to do a longer scan, but really, so that's why we want to do larger core plugs. So we're able to get more volume. So we're hoping that there's more fluid in the sample. There's more porosity.
Right. How big of a sample do you need to run this test?
So for the lab, I always tell people, hey, give me at least 50 milligrams, because that gives me a pretty good shot at getting that milliliter of fluid cutoff that we need. So we can run inch diameter, we can run 1.5 inch diameter, and then the length can vary accordingly.
And you're doing it on core plugs, correct?
Yes. So right now, the unconventional workflow I mentioned, that is specifically on the core plugs that we have in the lab. So we'll either drill them or we'll do it on rotary sidewall core plugs as well.
What about cuttings? Cuttings is big for us.
Yes.
And our clients, because we want to do what our clients want. How does that work for cuttings?
So that's actually something that we've been researching now, because like you said, everybody has cuttings from their wells, and cuttings also have a lot of inherent difficulties, a lot of inherent error associated with them. But at the same time, if that's the only sample data you have, then we need to work and see what valuable data, whether it's reliable, that's reproducible, that we can obtain from the cuttings. So something that we have been doing just within Premier is we've been looking at NMR on cuttings specifically. We've been partnering and trying to figure out projects and do things. So right now we're actually in the process of trying to perfect a technique that would give you something reliable, reproducible for cuttings.
Okay. Matt, when we were talking prior to going on, the machine itself you can get different variations of the NMR machines, right? Kind of like a car, you can get different models. Can you talk to that and how that's confusing to me? Is it frequencies, the different frequencies, and how they change the analysis?
And again, I'll try to break it down fairly simply. Everything, like if you have a radio car, you have a signal from essentially your remote to that car. And these machines, they're going to have a signal, and then we're going to have a receiver. We're going to record it. So that signal to noise ratio, which is what we're kind of talking about here, and this is why it's different between machines, depends on how much we're outputting, and you mentioned it, frequency. Increasing the frequency improves that ability to record a better signal and reduces your overall noise. When you do that, it allows you to see data very early in that life cycle. I mentioned that T1, kind of where we're that very early portion in the T2. So the very first responses, if we have essentially a lower frequency machine, are invisible. We just don't see them. We have to extrapolate it. So when you increase frequency, you can start to actually see that data, and it becomes very powerful. That's actually what the paper, one of the papers I wrote was on.
Okay, and maybe we can include that paper for people who are interested. You can email us, and we can give you that information offline. So it's another tool in the toolbox for exploration for oil and gas. Where is it? We're going to wrap up a bit, but I'd throw this out to both of you. Where do you see NMR fitting in right now for companies who are doing exploration? Is it a must-have? Is it I'd like to have it? Where is it now, and where do you see it, in the next year or so? Maybe I'll start with you, Elizabeth, and then we can go to Matt.
Sure. I'm entirely biased, and I think you'll always need some NMR data, but that's just because I've been working in it with the lab. So I haven't done as much of the exploration side of it, but from my perspective, I think NMR will be always incredibly valuable. I mean, in a year or two from now, I'd like to see how this NMR cuttings develop, seeing what papers are published on there. Hopefully after this whole pandemic dies down, we'll be able to actually go to meetings and talk to each other and actually gain knowledge and share that knowledge. So in the future, I think we'll be able to get something a little bit better on cuttings that's going to be more reliable. Again, cuttings have their own inherent error, but having something rather than nothing is better.
Yeah. Matt?
In my opinion, it's highly valuable. I should mention something that's really important for this, at least for an operator. In the past with NMR, you had to run, you thought you needed to run core analysis to calibrate your wireline logs. Now you don't actually really need to do that. You can run core independently. And that's a really important feature, because sometimes if you don't want to run, or you don't have the ability to run a wireline log, that core, and specifically what Elizabeth mentioned, the cuttings, can become one of the most valuable things you're going to have in your well, to the point it may be the most necessary. Because when you're doing exploration now with the price environment is the way it is, you need to know ahead of time, are you going to have the volumes? And then specifically, are you going to have the deliverability to perm? And that's the other big thing you're going to get from this NMR. That T2 I mentioned before, in terms of the time it takes, that is a representation that's been proven through papers to be pore size. So if you're an exploration company and you want to know if this well is going to deliver, that's basically one of the only measurements you're going to get that's going to be conclusive at the moment for some of these tighter rocks. So I'd say it's probably on that crucial level of what I want to run.
Yeah, well, that's especially with your consulting business as is. I imagine most of your clients are coming to you for that specifically, right? The NMR information.
It's one of those, because of my knowledge with the NMR and how it affects some of your in-place values, because it all comes back to that. And not just on the exploration side. I got to say, on the development side, this thing is proving to be more and more necessary. Everyone's talking about spacing and how much is left. Well, if you don't have the volumes, it's a tough argument. And NMR, from what I get in consulting, if I run any of it, it really firms up the value, and people get very happy with it.
Yeah, and I just to wrap up, I think it is becoming more and more popular. We're finding from when we're talking to clients, they're asking, oh, I didn't know Premier had that capability. And, that's kind of the reason why we wanted to do this podcast as well, is to let people know that Premier does do NMR, and just to educate them. So we obviously can't cover everything on NMR. This was an intro for people just to kind of get a feel for the basics. And for those who are listening and those who are watching, you can definitely reach out to us, and we can fill in the blanks with more information. And especially Matt, your company as well, EPOCH Consulting. I'm sure you'd be happy to receive people and questions. So really to wrap up, thank you everybody today for taking the time. Elizabeth, just down the hall from me, and obviously a little further away, Matt, really appreciate your time. So to everybody, thanks for listening to Crude Talk, and until next time.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Justin.